You can learn a lot about a team from its name. Just as All Blacks smothers other colours, Wallabies bounce up and down, and Springboks migrate, though admittedly in real life not to Manchester, so many nicknames and mighty monikers in rugby seem to give life and character to the teams that adopt them. The Harlequins entertain, the Crusaders slay everything in front of them, Bath leaks, the Dragons die in every story where they might appear, Zebra are always slaughtered, the Stormers pass, Kilgronis do business like they're hungover, Loughborough Lightning don't strike twice, Northampton Saints are... okay, maybe forget that one. The Brumbies are always dark horses, Tel Aviv Heat cools down quickly, Sale Sharks feel dead-eyed and soulless, the Bulls always charge head-on, and the Ospreys have a problem with dying out in Scotland. The Leicester Tigers are no exception. Historically, the most lethal creature in its habitat, the tiger hunts and the tiger kills. But when I dug into this 4 years ago, I had my claws out. No longer in the era of nature's deadliest predator, Longleat's most visible escapees were at the start of a free fall. Gone were the days of enormous strength, brutal teeth and killer instincts. Leicester went from simply missing out in the playoffs to a full-on crisis, only saved from a year in the Championship exile by some very fortuitously timed cheating by Saracens. Los Tigres, as Julio Montoya probably calls them when talking to his mum, spared relegation only by a second enormous points deduction to send perhaps the only club that really, their name just have nothing to do with who they are, nothing at all, down to the second division. Things looked cold, scary, hopeless. The tiger needed to evolve, likely saber teeth and thicker fur, because they were going to get frozen out for some time to come. Then things started to change. Just as Bristol Bears sounds like the name of a West Country gay club, and under Pat Lam they play like it's drag bingo night, Leicester Tigers started to play like a tiger again. An apex predator with pads on its feet so nobody can hear it coming. An animal that takes down one major meal a week in slow and brutal fashion. So, with the East Midlands proudest now headed to their first Premiership Final in 10 years, just how have Steve Borthwick's rabble rolled back the years and made their stripes shine once again? The old idiom goes that Tiger can't change those stripes, but they certainly can change their coach. Leicester firing 5 bosses in 3 years as they shuffled and shook an already explosive situation, the Tigers board providing a masterclass in what not to do as they turned one season of missing out in the playoffs to near relegation by overreacting to every setback before realising this was only making things worse and doubling down on the worst available solution they found. It was a phenomenal period of nonsense as one of England's oldest, proudest and most successful clubs lampooned themselves with constant, pointless bullshit until they'd gone beyond laughingstock to something worth only really feeling sorry for. The Tigers creating situations so sad even fans of rival clubs who'd grown up hating the bastards now felt genuine pity. However, right as it felt the rot had truly set in, Tigers decided it was time for one last change of head coach. After a decade of steadily increasing buffoonery, they needed something different. They needed someone who can cut through any and all nonsense. They needed this.
Can I call you the man at the helm in terms of reshaping Leicester Tigers? Steve, is that an appropriate title?
No, head coach.
Head coach. Head coach will do then.
If you look up the antonym of nonsense, you get a little drawing of Steve Borthwick folding his arms, and that was exactly what Leicester Tigers needed. Borthwick was always an interesting player because you could tell that his raw knowledge, understanding and passion for the game outstripped his actual athletic ability, and this was something that then Japan boss, Eddie Jones, who I've talked about before, recognised during his time as a consultant at Saracens. Identifying Borthwick could make such a good coach, he flew him out to take on the role of line-out guru before Borthwick had even ceased playing. This awakened something in Borthwick. He promptly retired, and just 18 months later, he was maybe the most in-demand forwards coach in the game after getting the tiny Japanese pack into such a shape they could compete with the almighty Springboks. Borthwick's focus on alternate technique, built around individual players' strengths instead of chasing what was traditionally popular and worked, proved that, for once, the Cherry Blossoms really was just a name, and this team could not be blown aside. He then followed Eddie to England, where he built an eight that could dismantle and destroy anybody but the Springboks, taking England to 3 Six Nations titles and a World Cup final before deciding it was time to make the step up to number 1 and join the Tigers' hunt. With the Big Cats being his first time as a big dog, Borthwick has been very honest and upfront about his learning process. He took over during the COVID-19 lockdown and used the rearranged fixtures from the second half of the pandemic-struck season as a free hit. Saracens' automatic relegation meant Tigers were safe yet unable to finish in the European places. So Borthwick used it as a free chance to trial tactics and patterns against active opposition and learn from the issues he encountered. This took many forms, but Borthwick has always been very honest about his approach to learning. Tigers' kicking game was exploited in his early games, so he went and consulted experts on the backfield. Leicester's defence needed work, so he hired Rugby League legend Kevin Sinfield to run it. The squad photos needed taking, so Borthwick went to Skillshare. Borthwick has said he was struck when he came in by how few non-academy players were on long-term contracts, meaning it was tricky to build anything because nobody knew if they'd be there in 18 months' time. So in order to avoid further budgetary issues, Borthwick decided to take the squad photos himself, and using Skillshare, he was able to come from a complete standing start, knowing nothing about photography, and build his skill set up. In mere minutes, he was learning from world-renowned experts on how to properly use a DSLR. He could move on to photographic composition, learning how to frame a shot. Before he knew it, he was fully immersed, feeling a new passion for how colour can tell a story. In amongst learning to use Photoshop, Borthwick then let an astonishing 38 players in his first season go, and a further 32 leave the club the following year. But by dipping into Skillshare's business section, he was able to set them up for life after rugby, and could recommend the perfect place for them to learn so many new skills. And if you too want to learn anything from animation to analytics, the first 1,000 people to use the link in the description will receive an entirely free 1-month trial to Skillshare, the perfect website to learn all sorts of mad, wonderful skills. And you never know, you might find yourself taking Tiger squad photos next season. All of this allowed Borthwick to build not just a photography portfolio, but a squad and backroom staff that looked exactly as he wanted. Where Tigers previously bought players that didn't suit their style of play, seemingly just for the sake of it because they were big names, instead of cloning Kyle Eastman, Steve Borthwick just panned for gold. Players didn't have to be recognisable, they just had to suit the style of play he wanted. Nick Dolly was an unheralded signing from a Coventry team, so untalked about, they literally play at a ground called Butts Park, and nobody has ever taken the piss out of them for it because nobody's heard of them. And yet, Dolly proved to be exactly the player Leicester systems needed, ending his first season at Tigers as one of the Premiership's top try scorers and an England international. Tigers of old were famous for being the most hideous bastards you'll ever play against, and the likes of Dolly captured the evolution of the club perfectly, able to make passes like this in the wide channels, yet also personifying the kind of intelligence and confidence that are necessary to make the niggle work, such as in this try when facing the club with the actual most hideous bastard you'll ever play against. With this Maule's progress starting to slow, Youngs comes in to get the ball out, but Dolly is confident. He feels they're going to score, so slips the ball into the other arm away from Youngs, ironically towards the touchline, so you know. However, Adam Coleman does a pretty great job of swimming around the outside, so Green here sneakily uses his foot to hook Coleman's legs away for just a second to knock him off balance. Suddenly, the resistance falls. The only way Notts RFC can stop this is with Coleman committing a clear yellow card penalty try offence, meaning Sexfest Paddy's kingdom of complicit pricks has no choice but to let Dolly score. And any bigger name signings were shrewd. Matt Scott had fallen out of favour with Scotland, but Tigers has given him a new lease of life. With Jaguares broken up by COVID, Tigers pounced on their fellow Cats carcass and snapped up 3 players, knowing the short notice meant they could get them below their usual asking price. Julian Montoya, Argentina captain and one of the best hookers in the world, has made an enormous impact, shortlisted for Premiership Player of the Season, but even less heralded was the other chunk of meat won in the hunt. Pumas regular Matthias Moroni. Moroni has been one of the most underrated players on the planet for nearing a decade now because the things he does best are so small. He's a sublime defender, the kind who, instead of making big hits, just knits together any holes to make the whole thing impenetrable. Here, knowing Leicester short numbers, some would try and make a big smash, but Moroni just subtly presses both Randrandra and Lloyd, committing to neither, just encouraging the pair of ballers to ball, and in the end, they force a play and, this. And Moroni brings that same mindset to the attack. Here off turnover ball, Ford wraps around and Moroni goes with him. But, noticing his 10 is targeting this man, Moroni pulls out the play completely. This might seem an odd thing to praise, but most players at all levels would try and run on Ford's shoulder here, but they would only get in the way. Moroni instead identifies Stewart is in the best position to exploit this to use the space, a better position than he can ever get into, so Moroni steps away in order to allow Ford to throw a crisper pass. Stewart links up with Ashton, who would score if not for an unbelievable tackle from Adam Radwan. It's similar to this. With Bristol biting in, Moroni identifies this has pulled defenders up from the backfield, so stabs it through, but whilst he intended it as a kick to chase himself, he realises Ashton is in a better position, so steps off and trusts his winger to score. It's intelligence above ego, a reading of the game that requires weighing up everybody's role, not just your own. and it's something true and prescient throughout the entire Tigers squad. These are the kind of players they've targeted and also built from the academy under Borthwick. This is a full squad of team players, uninterested in individual glory. If last year's Quinn side radiated joy, it was clear that the entire squad loved playing rugby and especially loved doing it together. This Tigers team is all about trust. I've scarcely seen another club team that looks so confident in the man next to them's abilities. And of course, nobody sums the spirit up more than George Ford. It's time I get to talk about George Ford more. Now, anybody who's watched any of my videos in the past has probably heard me wank over George Ford endlessly. But he's just really good. He's just really, really good at rugby. And he adds so many layers to Leicester's game that they're practically an onion. His contributions are often subtle, but always critical. This against Bristol is a perfect example. Fort has called for a carry by Genge so they can isolate this defender the following phase if they get quick ball. This itself is smart. But when the baby runner bounces off the tackle, Ford receives the chance early. Now, virtually any fly half-forward wide would do this. They kind of run it and look to draw the fullback. But instead, Ford does this. He deliberately slows down and checks himself before giving the pass to Stewart. Why? Watch Fricker in 14 for Bristol. He turns around and sprints towards the corner flag to make the covering tackle, anticipating Ford doing that. If Ford goes himself, Fricker catches up with him and allows Piatow to drift onto Stewart and Ashton, likely making a tackle. But this early pass by Ford forces Fricker to check himself. Ford is no longer the target, he's now an obstacle. Fricker has to stop, slow down, adjust where he's running to get around Ford and then suddenly change the direction he was running in anyway. It all costs him the second it would take to make the distance up and means Bristol's forwards behind him stand absolutely no chance. The quality of modern cover defence means the situation rarely results in a try, but Ford's tiny subtle touch takes out 27 of the 30 players on the pitch, meaning it's suddenly a 2-on-1 and Stewart executes it to send Ashton over in the corner. And speaking of Chris Ashton, I think ironically for a team so focused on the forwards, we can learn a huge amount about the Tigers from studying their wingers. Nemani Nandolo and Chris Ashton were once both huge names in rugby, icons of their national team, celebrated much wider, but both had kind of, perhaps unfairly, dropped out the sport's public consciousness. Nandolo down to his decision to stand down from Fiji duty just before the World Cup, and Ashton after a rough few years where he got thrown out of more clubs than Mike Phillips over a whole weekend. But instead of getting stuck in the past, at Leicester, both have been allowed to show once again why they were such valued players in the first place. Chris Ashton's gifts often speak for themselves, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't be celebrated. His support line here, adjusting and identifying where the space is around the teammate, is just world class. I don't think the game has ever produced a player better at picking support lines than him, but the bits that fall under the radar are the work rate and patience that go with it. I wasn't able to find stats for this season at Tigers, but in his Saracens days, Chris Ashton ran more metres off the ball than any other back in the entirety of pro rugby, season after season. We can frequently see him run, chase, adjust, just on the off chance there'll be a break so that he can be in a perfect position if it does happen. But equally, if the space is elsewhere, watch how tight he hugs the touchline, holding his width and allowing Ford to just pinpoint the ball to him for one of his 7 tries in 7 starts for Tigers this season. A stat that would make Nandolo's 10 tries in 16 starts seem less impressive if only the Fijian phenomenon wasn't so regularly crucial to other parts of their game. Leicester play forwards rugby, but when Nandolo's on the field, they essentially get to play it with 9 of them, frequently bringing him in to do tight stuff, whether it's utilising him on the pick and go or carrying threats in moves such as these. This is just super simple. It's a typical boot play, where the back is lingering behind a forward acting as a screen, but instead of distributing, Nandolo runs hard. And it results in a try here. Tom Young is essentially just mowing the grass for Nandolo, just opening the path through. And then here, the jolly green bunch of morally bankrupt bastards are pretty much watching for the same play, expecting Nandolo to run the hard line behind the forwards, but noticing these inturned hips, Nandolo switches it brilliantly and picks this line outside him to once again go under the sticks. It's like he's his own dummy runner. The threat of his power is so great, he will forget about his pace, switching from being an extra forward to a winger at the last second. There's a similar ploy used with Guy Porter, who they've used on the wing a lot as well, where he'll switch from being a centre to a winger at the last second as well. And even someone without the sheer versatility of Porter, the explosiveness of Nandolo, or the history of running lines of Ashton, Tigers can find a way to rope their wingers into the forwards game. Whilst Ford and Ashton might have their histories in rugby league, perhaps the most impressive code switch at Tigers lately has been the convert from Quidditch, wing wizard Harry Potter. Stepping into the real world to escape the toxic, bigoted mind of J.K. Rowling might have been too much for some players, but Potter took to it like a Grindylow to water, and this try is perfect proof. With the Tigers' maul stopped, Genge is forced to offload, but Potter decides to enter contact incredibly upright. This gives the forwards leaving the maul a new target, and they lock on to form a new maul, and the Worcester tacklers begin to focus on the forwards joining instead. Oh! Poop. Potter can flu powder his way through the tackle and apparate on the other side, allowing him to cross the try line diagonally to score 5 points for Gryffindor. Yes, I only include this try because I have way too much information on this book permanently lodged in my head from childhood, and just know if Saracens ever signed a player called Doctor Who, I'd do exactly the same thing. There's a perfect example of Tigers putting it all together in this superb score against Leinster. In the stoppage before the line-out, we can see Ashton, usually a right winger, drift out to the left, and Ford instructs Nandolo, usually on the left, to fill in on the right. Leicester form them all, and just in case their evil twin, Leinster, sneaks in and stops it, they position not just Nandolo off to the side, but Genge and Visa on the fringe of the maul, meaning they can break off easily, and Tigers' three biggest carriers are all on their feet the following phase. Nandolo filling in as auxiliary forward on Genge's latch, a role Ashton never could have filled if they hadn't swapped. Tigers proceed to play more phases, but the entire time George Ford's focus is not on his own team, but Gary Ringrose, constantly glancing over and taking notes of the centre's positioning. Ringrose is the man who leads the Leinster defence, who makes the big decisions, who everyone else reacts to, and Ford knows they're not getting through them unless they get him gone. Then, Ford spots this very interesting defensive picture. The repeated carries have tied in the forwards, leaving this. Jubilee Sex Platinum is the first defender beyond the ruck, and Ringrose his only real support. Ford points at Sex Flannel, and Genge needs no second invitation. He runs straight at Jaguara's Sex Rat, and Ringrose steps in to support. Knowing this is the moment, Ford doesn't scream for the ball, but instead turns to Porter and tells him which dummy line to run. Ringrose is getting back into position, so this line holds all the men inside him, by which I mean in the ruck. There's not some sort of like Osmosis Jones situation. There's not like 16 tiny Dublin or rugby players running around inside Gary. I'd love it if there was. Maybe there should be. Maybe we could make that film. Anyway, and it leaves Ringrose in no man's land. Ford throws a perfect pass that's out of his hands quicker than Keenan can turn, unleashing Ashton to score in the corner. Once again, George Ford is the greatest rugby mind I've ever seen on the field, and it's just a shame Ford Dupree retires so the two of them can't have some kind of wild career-spanning wizard duel like the Prestige, but with a rugby ball, where Dupree gets so mind-blown by Ford's form for Leicester Tigers this season that he goes to see a version of Grant Fox played by David Bowie, who invents you a box that does these big kicks that your fullback just automatically renders underneath them when they start to come down. Tigers may be the name of the team, but for all the worth it has, at times this season they felt more like a unicorn. You could do this kind of micro-analysis on virtually every club in Europe not called Bath and find compelling reasons to call them class, but Leicester managed to consistently be more than some of their parts. This has been Borthwick's real impact at the club. We all knew he could show up their scrum and line out. We saw last season they could play excellent flashes, but this year has added a cohesion. For all his no-nonsense persona, watch any interview of Borthwick talk about his players and a clear emotional intelligence comes through. He has set goals for where everyone needs to be, but he works to motivate each player as an individual so they can all reach them in their own way. It's only with the kind of buy-in and environment of trust like this creates that you can see the resilience required to pull so many late-stage victories out of the Tiger Print bag, such as this against Saracens, the phenomenal Ford-inspired last 30 against Northampton in the semi-final, or their frankly remarkable winner versus Bristol on Boxing Day. It's full of so many moments that sum the team up. The patience and collectedness of Ford to play some smart kick tennis with 2 minutes on the clock. Confidence to go absolutely for broke on the kick, leading to Pietau being forced into one of the most skillful knock-ons you'll ever see before the play itself. Leicester is so responsive, so alert, so calm, so cool, taking instruction from Ford as he masterminds the play. The whole time, sat back with his body language saying, drop goal, I'm gonna go for the drop goal, I'm going for the drop goal. Then he brings Maroney in here to act as a screen, and instead of throwing the pass here, which would allow Bristol to drift, he throws this simple ball early to Kelly, meaning he can give the pass early as well, meaning Potter gets time on the quaffle. Leicester start going backwards, but Ford doesn't panic. He just looks side to side, knowing that kind of defensive effort has taken extra defenders, and he calls the ball out to himself again. His eyes are on Luatua until he receives the ball, at which point he looks only wide, eyeing up this missed pass, wanting to suck the All Black in. The moment Luatua commits, instead of throwing the pass he was eyeing up, he drops it off to Stewart, who draws his man and gets it to Porter eventually. Ford is immediately back on his feet with a plan. Leicester were previously playing a 1-3-3-1 and Ford evidently calls for a 1-3-2-2. But Thacker adapts a split second late and blocks his return ball from Hayes, which would have allowed Ford to open up the space on this side instantly. However, this is where the shrewd signings come in. Richard Wigglesworth might have turned 39 last week, but you don't play 300 plus games of Premiership, these aren't exaggerations, it's genuinely the truth, without picking up a few tricks that can sustain a career once your pace is gone. And he's more than able to take over whilst Ford starts to re-strategise. Without needing a prompt, Wigglesworth manages to play for a while before Ford has reshaped his backs. Maroney times things perfectly, and Porter wriggles up to within metres of the line. And again, Ford has a plan. Tigers set incredibly flat because this phase isn't about going forward, it's about Ford assessing where it's best for the next ruck to take take place based on the defensive line. He has 4 options and sends Genge between these 2 tacklers, which gives the Bristol forwards a greater distance to fold. They've got to run, further to get round to the other side of the ruck in order to reach the blind side, meaning they're kind of disorganised, and it's on if they can suck in Purdy here. However, Purdy makes a brilliant read, and a second plan in a row has been foiled. But it's no trouble. Wigglesworth takes over again, whilst Ford returns to the mental war room. Except he realises he kind of doesn't need a plan. He needs a play. The George Ford I normally celebrate is George Ford, the tactical genius who plays the game 6 phases in advance. But it's easy to forget George Ford, the dynamic attacking 10 who first made the England team a decade ago whilst playing for Bath, is still locked inside. And he snaps back. He arcs and allows Stewart to draw the last man before offloading to Dolly. The hooker then executes perfectly. Guy Porter in the corner to win the game in the 84th minute. I do wonder whether Leicester will lose some of their potent 200 Apollo coming in next season. The biggest boot in Somerset West is probably the perfect 10 for this team's style of play, which is why I worry it'll be less effective. George Ford is a fly half who suits the team's philosophy, their culture perfectly, but not their style, and that's genuinely allowed him to add things to the team, creating new dimensions in their play that I don't know if Pollard, exceptional as he is the man to look for. But, of course, none of that is relevant for now, because they keep hold of Ford for one last weekend as they head into a Premiership Final that will cause this video to age very quickly in one of 2 directions, as we find out just how much is in that name. An apex predator, an incredible killing machine, capable of slaughtering hordes of humans, be they Saracens, Saints, or very lost court jesters. We don't know if they can do it just yet, but we do know one thing for certain. Even if it takes a rough few seasons, a tiger can always change its stripes. Thank you for watching that. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had a good time. It's about time I updated it based on, where this video was when I made it 4 years ago. Similar to the La Rochelle a few weeks ago, and I'll be covering the next final in the next week or so before we move on to far more in July. So there's plenty more coming. And I hope you have a poke around the channel. There's a video on how France won the Six Nations, one on Eddie Jones. There's also the podcast where I'm covering the 87 World Cup in full. If you want to hear about the fact that the bear from The Revenant, the guy who played the bear in the film The Revenant and mauled Leonardo DiCaprio, played for Canada. All sorts of stuff. You want to have a fun around. I'll see you very soon for more stuff.
Potter. Oh, and Potter has come through. Well, how did that happen?
And all the anger and the upset and the pain and the frustration that has built comes tumbling through the stands at the Stonex. Ben Earl has a hat-trick.